A quiet morning walk, a cruel act, and a broken cane that ignited a fight for justice. Clarence Walker's journey isn't just about what he lost, it's about what he inspired. Watch how one man's strength sparked a movement that no one saw coming. In the small town of Franklin Square, Georgia, there's a man named Clarence Walker, a 76-year-old African-American man who lost his sight at 48. But Clarence wasn't one to let the darkness of his world define him. He'd lived most of his life blind, and still, every morning, he took his daily walk through the town square. It was part of his routine, part of his connection to the world he couldn't see but could feel so deeply. On most days, Clarence would move through Franklin Square like a ghost, his cane tapping rhythmically on the cracked pavement, guiding him like an old companion. His cane wasn't just a mobility aid, it was a link to his past, a keepsake from his late wife, Angela Walker, who had passed away a decade ago. She had been his rock, his strength when the world seemed to take everything from him. Clarence's walk was more than just exercise, it was his lifeline. The wind would rustle the sycamore trees, whispering directions to him. The soft crunch of gravel under his boots told him where to step next. Every day he moved in a dance with the world, a rhythm he'd perfected over years of practice. But this morning was different. Normally, Clarence would pass the bakery on the corner, the warm smell of cinnamon filling the air, and then he'd make his way across the small bridge that divided Franklin Square in two. It was a peaceful route until it wasn't. Today, as Clarence passed the bench under the old oak tree, he noticed something was off. A man in a police uniform was standing just ahead, staring at him with cold, sharp eyes. Clarence didn't see him, of course, but he could feel the tension in the air. The man's presence was heavy, purposeful. The officer's boots crunched louder on the gravel as he stepped forward, his shadow looming over Clarence. A familiar feeling of discomfort settled in Clarence's stomach. He'd seen this before, the way certain people would approach him with suspicion. He'd felt it in the past, the sharp edge of racism, of being perceived as a threat simply because of the color of his skin. But it was usually more subtle. This felt different. "Excuse me, sir." The officer's voice broke the silence, sounding more like an accusation than a question. "What are you doing out here by yourself?" Clarence paused for a moment, his cane tapping lightly on the ground. "I'm fine, just taking my morning walk," he said, his voice calm but firm, a familiar calmness he'd mastered over the years of walking these streets. He was used to people questioning his presence, but there was something unsettling about this officer's tone. The officer stepped closer, his voice sharp as he asked again, "You're out here alone?" It wasn't a question this time, it was an interrogation. Clarence could sense the officer's disdain, the way he was sizing him up, judging him for something he couldn't even see. "I've walked this park for years," Clarence replied, the words rolling off his tongue with the precision of someone who had repeated them 1,000 times. "I know every inch of it." The officer didn't seem convinced. He gave a low chuckle, not one of humor, but of disbelief. "Well, maybe that's part of the problem." Clarence felt his blood begin to simmer. He could tell the officer wasn't really concerned about his well-being. There was no kindness in his voice, no real care. It was the kind of condescending tone that Clarence had heard all too often, the one that made him feel small, invisible. "You should really be more careful," the officer added, stepping closer again. "The world's not as kind as it used to be." Clarence's grip on his cane tightened. He was used to this kind of treatment, used to being treated like he didn't belong, like he was invisible. But this time, something inside him snapped. He wasn't going to let this man continue to diminish him. "Yeah," Clarence said, lifting his chin slightly, his voice still calm but with a new steel to it. "The world's not as kind to people like me." The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, Clarence heard a sharp movement, a quick motion that startled him. Before he could react, the officer grabbed his cane out of his hands, yanking it away so forcefully that Clarence stumbled slightly, caught off guard. "Hey!" Clarence's voice cracked with surprise, panic threading through it. "What do you think you're doing?" But the officer didn't answer. Instead, he yanked the cane from Clarence's grip, and Clarence could feel the anger radiating off him. He didn't need to see the officer to know what was happening. The way his heart started pounding in his chest, the feeling of powerlessness rising within him. And then, it happened. Clarence heard the unmistakable sound of wood snapping, a clean, brutal break. His cane, the one that had belonged to Angela, the one that had helped him navigate the world for nearly 30 years, was broken in two. It was like a cruel punch to the gut. Clarence stood there in stunned silence as the officer tossed the pieces of the broken cane at his feet, like they were nothing more than trash. "Next time, don't get smart with me," the officer muttered, his voice thick with contempt. And just like that, he turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Clarence standing in the middle of Franklin Square, his world just a little darker. Clarence didn't scream. He didn't yell. He didn't even cry. He just stood there, frozen in the sunlight, the broken cane lying at his feet, a symbol of everything he had fought against in his life. Clarence stood motionless for a few moments, the weight of the officer's actions settling over him like a heavy fog. He could hear the distant hum of traffic and the rustling of leaves in the trees, but it all seemed so far away. The broken cane lay at his feet, a reminder of his vulnerability in a world that often saw him as less. The people nearby, the ones who had witnessed what had just happened, said nothing. Clarence could hear the whispers in the background, murmurs of discomfort, of avoidance, of people turning a blind eye. He had grown accustomed to this silence, to being overlooked, to not being seen until someone had a reason to exploit or humiliate him. And yet there was something different today. A part of him, deep inside, was no longer willing to accept the silence. He didn't move right away. His fingers brushed against the splintered wood of the cane, still warm from his grip. He picked up the two broken pieces slowly, carefully, as if they were fragile treasures rather than the cruel symbols of his humiliation. His hands shook slightly, but not from fear. No, he was beyond that. This was something else, something stronger. Clarence turned and began the long walk home, his pace slow, deliberate. The world around him felt different now. The sounds of the street, the smells of the bakery and the coffee shop, they were all there, but it was as though he was walking through them in a haze. His mind raced, but not with thoughts of revenge or anger. Those feelings were too loud, too chaotic. No, Clarence's mind was filled with a quiet, steady resolve. He had been disrespected in the worst way, but he knew he had something stronger than anger to carry him through this. When he reached his home, he sat down at the kitchen table, the two broken pieces of the cane resting in front of him. He wrapped them carefully in an old linen napkin and placed them gently on the table, like a relic, a reminder of a life he thought he understood. He didn't immediately call anyone. He didn't feel the need to. There would be time for that. For now, the world could wait. But the stillness of his home, the quiet that had once felt comforting, now felt like an oppressive weight. It was as though the air had thickened with something heavy, something that would eventually demand to be addressed. Hours passed before there was a knock at the door. Clarence didn't need to ask who it was. He recognized the steady rhythm of footsteps, the nervous shift of weight outside his door. He opened it slowly, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for the knob. Standing there was James Turner, the young man from the coffee cart, his eyes wide with nervous energy. "Mr. Walker, I saw everything," James said, his voice shaky. I didn't know what to do, but I recorded it. I hope that helps." Clarence didn't say anything at first. He simply stepped aside to let James in. The young man handed Clarence his phone, and without a word, the older man pressed play. The video wasn't long, but it was enough. Enough to show the officer's disdain, the violent act of him yanking the cane from Clarence's hands, the sickening snap of the wood breaking. Clarence watched it, his eyes fixed on the screen, his chest tight. He felt a mix of emotions. Anger, yes, but also something else, something deeper. It was the recognition of how long this had been going on. How many people like him had been quietly silenced, ignored, abused in ways that no one seemed to care about. This wasn't just about a broken cane. It was about a system that had allowed people like Clarence to be treated as invisible. When the video ended, Clarence didn't immediately speak. He just sat there, the weight of what had happened settling deeper in his bones. James stood awkwardly in the doorway, not sure what to say next. "I'm sorry," James whispered, his eyes downcast. "I didn't know what else to do." Clarence looked up at him, his face softening. "It's not your fault, James," he said quietly, "but it is someone's fault." James nodded, unsure of what to do next. The moment hung between them, fragile, like the pieces of the broken cane still lying on the table. As James turned to leave, Clarence felt a small flicker of hope. He wasn't sure what would come next, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't completely alone in this. He wasn't sure what would happen when his son, Malik Walker, saw the video. Malik was a federal prosecutor who had been working in Washington, D.C., fighting for justice in high-profile cases. But this was personal. This was his father. And Clarence knew deep down that the moment Malik saw the video, there would be no turning back. Malik had always been the strong one, the one who carried the weight of their family's legacy, the one who fought for the voiceless in courtrooms. But this wasn't just another case. This was his own flesh and blood. His mother, Angela, had been the heart of the family, and now it was Clarence who needed his son's strength. For now, though, Clarence sat in his kitchen, alone with the pieces of his broken cane. The day had been long, but this was only the beginning, and Clarence knew, deep in his bones, that something would change. Whether the town was ready for it or not, the reckoning was coming. The next few days were a blur for Clarence. His body moved through the motions of life, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying the moment in Franklin Square again and again. The pain of that broken cane, the insult to his dignity, it was heavy, like a weight that settled into his chest, making it hard to breathe. But it wasn't just the broken cane that haunted him. It was the silence, the way no one had stepped in, the way people had watched and said nothing. Clarence had long known the world wasn't always fair. He'd lived his whole life in a world that had often looked the other way when people like him were mistreated. But this was something else. This wasn't just a moment of disrespect. It was a reminder of how deep the roots of hatred and division ran in the town. And that, more than anything, made him feel small. But then came the phone call. It was early in the morning when Clarence's phone rang. He knew who it was before he even picked it up. "Dad," Malik's voice came through the line, a mixture of concern and resolve. "I saw the video." Clarence closed his eyes for a moment, letting his son's words settle in. He'd known that Malik would see it eventually, but he hadn't expected it to feel like this. This sharp, twisting feeling in his stomach. "I'm coming home," Malik said, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of something darker, something Clarence had heard in his son's voice before, when he'd been dealing with injustices in the courtroom, fighting battles that were never supposed to be his to fight. "Malik, no need," Clarence said, his voice hoarse. "I don't want to bring this to your doorstep. I've dealt with worse in my time. You're doing good work up there. You have a life." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Clarence knew Malik was processing, weighing his options. He always did that. The young man was careful, strategic, but he was also fiercely loyal. And Clarence knew deep down that no matter how much he tried to shield his son from this, Malik would still come home. "I'm not leaving you to deal with this alone," Malik finally said, his voice softer now. "I'm coming back, Dad. I'll handle it." Clarence didn't respond. There wasn't much to say. He knew this was coming. And yet, part of him wished that Malik wouldn't have to deal with it. He had enough on his plate already. But another part of him, a part that had been quiet for too long, was relieved. For the first time in days, Clarence felt like he had someone in his corner. Someone who understood what this town could do to a person like him. Someone who could make the world listen when it wanted to pretend that nothing had happened. The days that followed felt heavy. Clarence moved around his house in a daze, his mind occupied with the thought of what would happen when Malik returned. He didn't want to say it out loud, but he knew. Things were about to change. Whether they were ready for it or not, this small town in Georgia was about to face a reckoning. Meanwhile, James Turner, the young man who had recorded the video, was also feeling the weight of the situation. He hadn't meant to get involved in something so big, so complicated, but he couldn't shake the image of Clarence standing there, his cane broken at his feet. He didn't know what to do next. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't a protester. He was just a kid trying to make a living, selling coffee on the corner. But he also knew something had to change. He had to do more than just record the injustice. He had to stand up for what was right. James decided to go to the police station. He didn't know what he expected to happen, but he had to do something. He had to make sure the officer who had treated Clarence so cruelly was held accountable. As he walked into the station, his heart pounded in his chest. He had no idea what kind of reception he would get, but he knew this was a step he couldn't take back. The officer behind the desk eyed him suspiciously as he approached. "Can I help you?" James hesitated. "I have information about Officer Clean," he said, his voice steady, though his nerves were running high. The officer raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting for James to continue. I have a video," James stammered, "of him abusing an elderly man, a blind man. It's on my phone." The officer's expression shifted slightly. He didn't look pleased. "You need to take that to the proper channels," he said flatly, his voice dismissive. James swallowed hard. "I thought this was the proper channel," he said, a note of defiance creeping into his voice. The officer narrowed his eyes. "You don't know what you're messing with, kid," he said quietly, leaning forward. "You don't know who you're up against." James stood tall, his nerves turning into something firmer, something stronger. "I know what I saw, and I'm not going to let it go." With that, he turned and walked out of the station, the weight of what he had just done sinking in. He wasn't sure what the next step would be, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let Clarence's story die in silence. When Malik arrived back in Franklin Square, it was early evening. The air was thick with the humidity of a Georgia summer, and the town felt strangely still, as if it were holding its breath. He hadn't been home in months. He had made his name in D.C., fighting cases, prosecuting corruption, making his parents proud. But now he was back in a place he never expected to return to under these circumstances. He stepped out of the cab in front of Clarence's house, his suitcase still in hand. The street was quiet, too quiet, as if the entire town knew that something was about to unfold. He didn't need to knock. He had a key. But still, as he opened the door, he was met with a silence that felt almost oppressive. "Dad?" he called softly, stepping into the house. Clarence was sitting by the window, his hands resting on his lap. The broken cane sat on the table in front of him, wrapped in the same linen napkin. "I knew you'd come," Clarence said quietly, not turning his head. His voice was calm, but there was something in it. Something that spoke of years of pain, years of silence. "I'm here," Malik said, his voice breaking slightly. "We're going to make this right, Dad. We're going to make sure this officer doesn't get away with it." Clarence didn't speak right away. He just sat there, his hands on the cane, as though contemplating everything that had led them here. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I don't know how far this will go, Malik," he said, his voice steady. "But it's time for the world to see what's been happening in the dark. It's time for them to hear me." The next few days in Franklin Square felt like a heavy silence before a storm. The town's streets were calm, the usual sounds of life echoing with a hollow, uneasy quiet. It was as though everyone knew something big was coming, but no one knew how or when it would hit. People were talking in hushed tones, but not many had the courage to say anything out loud. Malik, now back home, was determined. The video had spread, and more than a few people had begun to rally around the idea of holding Officer Clean accountable. They were tired of the injustice they had witnessed for years, but hadn't had the courage to speak up. Malik was here now, and the truth would no longer be buried. The more he thought about it, the more certain he was that this wasn't just about Clarence. It was about the whole community, about a system that had allowed this type of behavior to persist unchecked. Clarence didn't want to make a spectacle out of it. He wasn't looking for revenge. He wasn't even sure he wanted the attention. But there was something inside him that had been awakened, something that refused to be silenced anymore. He had spent his life walking through a world that didn't acknowledge him, a world that had been indifferent to his struggles, to his dignity. But now he wasn't going to let that happen again. The first step came when Detective Karen Elliott, who had been working the case from the inside, came to visit the family. Malik had known she was involved, but seeing her in person was different. She didn't mince words or offer empty promises. She came with facts, with determination. "I've been investigating Klain for a while," she said, sitting at the kitchen table across from Clarence and Malik. Her eyes were sharp, and her tone was no nonsense. "There have been complaints against him for over a year, but every time, there's no evidence, no video, no witnesses willing to come forward. But now we've got something solid." Malik glanced at Clarence, who sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap. "You're not the first," Detective Elliott continued, her voice low, almost as if she were speaking more to herself than to them. "But you're the first with proof, and that changes everything." Clarence nodded slowly. "I didn't want it to come to this, but I'm not running from it anymore," he said, his voice steady. "I won't let him get away with it. Not again." The conversation turned to strategy, how they would proceed. Malik had a plan, and it was clear that he wasn't going to let this go until justice was served. The evidence was there, but they needed more. They needed to show the world that this wasn't just about one officer's abuse. It was about a system that allowed such things to happen, unchecked and unchallenged. "We're going public," Malik said after a long silence. "This isn't just about us anymore. This is about making sure that no one else goes through what Dad went through. This isn't just about one broken cane. It's about the broken system that allowed it to happen." The day of the press conference arrived, and the room was filled with reporters, local leaders, and community members. The atmosphere was tense, electric. People had heard about the video, and now they were waiting to hear what Malik would say. Malik stepped up to the podium, his face calm but resolute. He adjusted the microphone, looked out at the crowd, and then spoke. "My name is Malik Walker," he began, his voice steady, carrying across the room. "And for those of you who don't recognize it, that's okay. But you probably know my father, Clarence Walker. He's been a part of this community for over 30 years. He's the man who walks this park every morning, even without his sight. He's the man who has lived through more than most people will ever know." The room was silent, hanging on every word. "And last week, my father was humiliated by the very people who are supposed to protect him. He was disrespected, treated like he didn't matter, and in broad daylight, one of your own officers, Officer Stephen Klein, broke his cane and tried to break his spirit." A murmur ran through the crowd. "This isn't just about one broken cane. This is about the kind of justice we've allowed ourselves to tolerate for too long. It's about the way we treat people who are easy to ignore. It's about the way we treat the most vulnerable members of our community." Malik paused for a moment, allowing his words to sink in. He could feel the weight of the room on his shoulders, but he didn't waver. He was used to standing in front of people, but this was different. This was personal. He held up the broken pieces of the cane, the very same ones that had been discarded on the ground like trash by Officer Klein. The jagged ends caught the light, and the room grew even quieter. Malik looked around, his eyes sweeping the crowd. "This cane isn't just broken. It's evidence. It's a symbol. And starting tomorrow, we're going to make sure it speaks louder than the silence that let it break." The crowd erupted, not in anger, but in resolve. This was the beginning of something bigger. This wasn't just about Clarence anymore. It was about every person who had ever been mistreated, overlooked, or silenced. The energy in the room shifted, and Malik could feel it. The winds were changing. As he finished, Malik looked to his father, who stood at the back of the room, supported by a few close friends. Clarence smiled, a small, knowing smile, but it was enough. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel so alone. "Thank you," Malik said, nodding to the crowd. "We're just getting started." The days following the press conference felt like a whirlwind. The town of Franklin Square, once quiet and reserved, had come alive with conversations, debates, and whispers. The story of Clarence Walker, the blind man whose cane had been broken by Officer Stephen Klein, had spread far beyond the town limits. Local news stations picked it up, and soon, the national media was knocking on doors. For the first time, people were talking about justice in ways they hadn't before. The silence that had once been so thick in the community was slowly being replaced by voices demanding accountability. But for Clarence, the noise was deafening. He had spent a lifetime walking quietly through a world that often ignored him, and now the world was watching him. He wasn't sure how he felt about it. The attention felt strange, uncomfortable, but it was also something he couldn't turn away from. Malik was working around the clock. He had enlisted the help of Detective Karen Elliott and a team of civil rights lawyers who had come forward, offering their support. They were preparing to file formal complaints against Officer Clean, but there was more to do. They had to ensure that this case didn't get buried, that the momentum kept going. "I'm ready to testify," Clarence said one evening as he and Malik sat in the kitchen, the broken cane between them. "But I don't want to make it bigger than it already is." "You're not making it bigger, Dad," Malik replied softly. "This is about showing the world that we won't stay silent anymore. People like you, like us, we deserve to be seen and heard." Clarence didn't respond right away. He looked down at the cane, his fingers tracing the splintered edges. It wasn't just a symbol of what had been taken from him. It was also a symbol of his resilience. He had walked through this world without the ability to see, but he had never stopped moving forward. Now he was going to make sure that the truth was seen. Weeks later, the first hearing took place. Officer Clean was there, sitting stiffly in his suit, surrounded by his lawyer and a small group of supporters. Clarence sat with Malik, his cane now whole again, a new symbol of his strength. The room was tense, and the air felt thick with anticipation. This wasn't just a court case. It was a battle for dignity. When it was his turn to speak, Malik stood up with his father by his side. His voice was calm, but it carried a quiet authority. "This isn't just about my father," he began. "This is about the system that let him, and so many others, be mistreated in ways that no one should ever have to endure." Clarence didn't speak much, but his presence said everything. He stood tall, his hands gripping his cane, his back straight. This wasn't just a father's fight anymore. It was a fight for all those who had been silenced for too long. In the end, Officer Clean was placed on indefinite suspension, and the case was handed over to the District Attorney's Office for criminal review. It wasn't a victory just yet, but it was a start. Clarence smiled as he left the courthouse with Malik by his side, the weight of the past few weeks lifting just a little. He had been heard, and now he was ready to move forward. "I didn't think I'd see the day," Clarence said quietly, looking up at the sky. "But I'm glad I did." Malik smiled, his arm around his father's shoulders. "You taught me how to fight, Dad," he said softly. "And you showed me that sometimes justice doesn't come quickly, but it does come." The world might not change overnight, but Clarence knew one thing. He had fought for his dignity, and in doing so, he had shown his son what true strength meant.